The air in the Crimson Garter saloon is thick with the smell of stale whiskey, sweat, and cheap perfume. It hangs in the haze of cigar smoke, clinging to the dark wood of the bar and the worn velvet of the chairs. A piano hammers out a tinny, cheerful tune that does nothing to lift the oppressive weight of the room. Tonight, the noise is louder than usual. A cattle drive has just ended, and the drovers are flush with cash and thirsty for trouble. Elias Thorne sits at a small table in the corner, nursing a single beer, the noise washing over him like a foul tide. He feels out of place, a solid piece of granite in a river of shifting sand. He's here for Jed Stone, not to fight him, but to pay him. Jed and his boys helped him round up a few strays that bolted during the last storm, and a deal was a deal. But Jed is holding court, his laughter a booming, arrogant sound that sets Elias's teeth on edge. At the center of Jed's orbit, like a glittering, gaudy planet, is Ruby. She's the saloon's prize, all crimson silk, flashing eyes, and a laugh that promises everything and nothing. The gunslingers and drovers swarm her, their hands greedy, their words slurred with drink and desire. Ruby, however, has her eyes on the quiet man in the corner. She disentangles herself from the crowd and saunters over to Elias's table, her hips swaying. She leans down, giving him a generous view of her cleavage. "You're looking lonely over here, Mr. Thorne," she purrs, her voice smoky. "A man like you shouldn't be lonely." Jed Stone watches from the bar, a smirk on his face. This is part of the show, the quiet, respectable rancher being tempted by the town's finest belle. It's a game they all play. Elias looks at her, at the carefully painted face and the hardness in her eyes, and feels nothing but a profound weariness. He's seen her type before. She's a survivor, same as him, just with different tools. His gaze drifts past her, to the far side of the room. There, a young woman is mopping up a spilled drink, her movements quick and silent, trying to make herself invisible. She keeps her head down, a curtain of mousy brown hair hiding her face. Her dress is gray and shapeless, faded from 100 washings. The men ignore her, stepping around her as if she were a piece of furniture, except for one who deliberately kicks the bucket, splashing dirty water over her worn boots. She doesn't react, just silently rights the bucket and continues her work. The men laugh. Elias's attention fixes on her. He's seen her before, a shadow flitting through the saloon, always on the periphery. They call her Croft's reject. The saloon owner, Silas Croft, took her on as an indentured servant, and the name stuck. The gunslingers, men like Jed who valued women by their flash and fire, wouldn't give her a second look. She was too plain, too quiet, too broken. Ruby follows his gaze and scoffs. "Don't waste your time on that one. She's got all the life of a dust bunny. Damaged goods." Elias looks back at Ruby, then at the girl, who has finished her task and now stands by the back door, her shoulders slumped. He sees the slight tremor in her hands. He sees the faint, silvery line of a scar that runs from the corner of her eye down her cheek, visible for a moment as she turns her head. And in that moment, something in him shifts. It's not pity. It's a flicker of recognition, a kinship with something wounded but resilient. He stands up, his chair scraping against the floorboards. The movement draws the attention of the room. He places a few coins on the table, more than enough for the beer. He looks Ruby straight in the eye. "Thank you for the offer, ma'am," he says, his voice low but clear. "But you're mistaken. I'm not lonely." He turns his back on her, a dismissal so complete it's like a slap in the face. He walks across the saloon, the crowd parting before him. Jed Stone frowns, his amusement fading. Elias stops in front of the girl in gray. She flinches, her eyes wide with alarm, expecting an insult or a drunken grope. She finally looks up at him, and he sees the fear in her pale blue eyes. He ignores Jed, ignores the stunned silence of the room, ignores the gasp from Ruby. He speaks to the girl, his voice gentle. "I need to settle a debt with Mr. Croft. Does he own your indenture?" She can only nod, her throat working. "Good," Elias says. He turns and faces the bar, where Silas Croft is polishing a glass, watching the scene with beady, calculating eyes. "Croft," Elias calls out, his voice now ringing with authority. "How much for her contract?" A collective intake of breath ripples through the saloon. Silas Croft's eyes gleam with avarice. Jed Stone throws his head back and laughs, a harsh, mocking sound. "Thorne, You lost your mind? You could have had a diamond, and you're trying to buy a lump of coal with a crack in it. Elias doesn't even glance at him. His focus is entirely on Croft, a silent battle of wills playing out across the smoky room. And with 3 words that sealed his fate and hers, he repeated his intent, his voice like stone. I'll take her. The ride back to his ranch was a study in silence. Her name, he'd learned from a smirking Croft, was Clara. The transaction had been swift and sordid. Elias had paid Croft the exorbitant price demanded, a sum that would set his finances back for a season, and had signed the paper that transferred her indenture to him. He hadn't looked at her as Croft shoved the document into his hand, a sneer on his face. He'd simply gestured for her to follow him, and she had, a small bundle of her meager belongings clutched in her hands. Now, she sat stiffly on the wagon seat beside him, as far away as she could get without falling off. The setting sun painted the vast, empty landscape in hues of orange and purple, but the beauty was lost on them. Elias focused on the road, the reins held loosely in his weathered hands. He could feel her fear radiating off her like heat from a stove. She probably thought she'd been traded from one master to another, expecting him to be like the rest of the men she'd known, cruel, demanding, and violent. The thought settled in his gut like a cold stone. He was a man of few words, a widower who had grown accustomed to the solitude of his ranch nestled in the high plains. His wife, Martha, had been taken by fever 3 winters ago, and the silence in his small cabin had been a constant, aching companion. He worked from sunup to sundown, pouring his grief and loneliness into the hard soil, his only conversations held with his horse and his dog, a grizzled old hound named Buster. He hadn't come to town seeking a woman. He'd come for supplies and to pay a debt. But seeing Clara, seeing the casual cruelty she endured, had stirred something in him, a protective instinct he thought had died with Martha. It was an impulse, a fool's gesture, and he was already feeling the weight of it. Clara stole a glance at him from beneath her lashes. He was older than her, maybe 35. His face was rugged, carved by sun and wind, with kind lines around his eyes that seemed at odds with his stern mouth. He wasn't handsome like the flashy gunslingers, but there was a quiet strength about him, a rootedness that she found both intimidating and, to her surprise, faintly reassuring. Still, she braced herself. She knew how these things worked. Kindness was a currency rarely spent without expectation of a return. She had nothing to offer but her labor, and she knew most men expected more. The scar on her cheek tingled, a phantom reminder of what could happen when a man's expectations weren't met. They finally arrived at the ranch as twilight bled into night. It wasn't much. A small, sturdy cabin, a solid-looking barn, and several corrals, all surrounded by endless miles of rolling grassland that faded into the dark silhouettes of distant mountains. It was isolated, a world away from the noise and grime of the town. Elias reined in the horses and jumped down. "We're here," he said, his voice gruff. He didn't offer to help her down. He just moved to unhitch the team, his movements economical and sure. Buster trotted out from the porch, tail wagging, and nudged Elias's hand before sniffing curiously in Clara's direction. She climbed down from the wagon, her legs stiff. The cabin looked warm, a single lamp glowing in the window. It looked like a home. The thought was so foreign, so painful, that she pushed it away. She was property. Homes were for people. Elias led the way inside. The interior was sparse but spotlessly clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs sat in the center of the room, and a small kitchen area was tucked into a corner. A closed door presumably led to a bedroom. "The loft is yours," he said, gesturing with his head toward a ladder leading to a small space above. "There's a cot and some blankets. I'll fetch you some water." He didn't look at her as he spoke. He moved about the small space with a practiced familiarity, lighting another lamp, stoking the fire. He was giving her space, she realized. He wasn't crowding her, wasn't making demands. He placed a bowl of stew and a piece of bread on the table. "Eat," he commanded softly, before taking his own plate and sitting on the porch steps, leaving her alone in the warmth of the cabin. Clara stared at the stew. It was thick with meat and vegetables, and the smell made her stomach clench with a hunger she hadn't allowed herself to feel. She ate quickly, mechanically, her eyes darting around the room. It was a man's space, simple and unadorned, but there was a sense of order, of peace. On a small shelf near the fire sat a single, framed photograph of a smiling woman with kind eyes. His wife. A pang of something unidentifiable went through her. Later, as she lay on the narrow cot in the loft, wrapped in a coarse but clean wool blanket, the unfamiliar sounds of the countryside replaced the saloon's cacophony. The wind whispered around the eaves of the cabin, and the floorboards below creaked as Elias moved about before settling in for the night. She lay awake for hours, listening, waiting, but no footsteps climbed the ladder. No demands were made. There was only the quiet, steady breathing from the man below and the vast, indifferent silence of the prairie. For the first time in a very long time, Clara felt a fragile, terrifying flicker of hope. She had been bought, yes, but maybe, just maybe, she hadn't been sold into the same kind of hell she'd just left. That night, a storm broke over the plains. It came suddenly, a furious assault of wind and rain that rattled the cabin's sturdy frame. Thunder cracked overhead, a sound like the sky splitting apart, and lightning bleached the world white for a split second. In the loft, Clara curled into a tight ball, her hands over her ears. The sound of the thunder, sharp and violent, clawed at the edges of a memory she kept locked away. It sounded like a door being kicked in, like a man's bellowing rage. A sob escaped her, small and choked. She bit down hard on her lip, trying to smother the sound, but another clap of thunder, louder this time, ripped a small cry from her throat. Down below, the creak of a mattress told her Elias was awake. She held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs. She heard his bare feet on the wooden floor. He was coming. The old fear, cold and familiar, washed over her. But he didn't climb the ladder. He stopped at the bottom. "You all right up there?" he called out, his voice low and rough with sleep. She couldn't answer. Her throat was tight with unshed tears. The silence stretched, filled only by the roar of the storm. He didn't ask again. Instead, she heard him move to the fireplace. The scrape of a match, and then a soft, orange glow filled the room below. He put another log on the embers, and the fire crackled to life. Then, she heard the scrape of a chair. He simply sat down by the hearth, a silent, steady presence against the storm's fury. He didn't press her, didn't demand an explanation. He just stayed there, a guardian in the night, letting her know she wasn't alone. Slowly, the terror receded, replaced by a profound sense of astonishment. This man, this stranger who owned her, was showing her a kindness she hadn't known since she was a small child. His quiet act of compassion was a shield against the storm both outside and within her. Eventually, lulled by the steady crackle of the fire and the sheer exhaustion of her fear, Clara drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, the world was washed clean. The air was crisp, and the sun shone brightly on a glistening landscape. When Clara came down the ladder, Elias was already by the stove, frying bacon. He'd left a basin of warm water and a clean rag for her on a small stand. He nodded a greeting, but said nothing about the night before. The unspoken understanding hung between them, a fragile thread of connection. After a silent breakfast, he spoke. "Forgot to get salt yesterday, and I need to see the blacksmith about a new shoe for the mare. I have to go back to town." Clara's stomach dropped. He would leave her here, alone, or worse, he would take her with him, back to the stairs and the whispers. He seemed to read her mind. "You can stay here if you like. You'll be safe," he hesitated, then added. "Or you can come with me. Your choice." It was the first choice she'd been given in years. The thought of staying alone in the isolated cabin was frightening, but the thought of facing the town was worse. Yet, the thought of being left behind, of him perhaps changing his mind and not coming back, was the most terrifying of all. "I'll come," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He just nodded. The ride into town was as silent as the one before, but the quality of the silence had changed. It was less fraught with fear and more with a cautious uncertainty. When they reached the edge of town, Elias pulled the wagon to a halt. He turned to her, his expression serious. "Folks will talk," he said, his voice flat. "Let them. You keep your head up. You're not saloon help anymore. You're under my protection." It was a clumsy declaration, but it was more than anyone had ever offered her. She nodded, gathering her courage. As they drove down the main street, the whispers started immediately. Faces appeared in windows, and people stopped on the boardwalks to stare. It was like running a gauntlet of judgment. Clara kept her eyes fixed on the back of the horse in front of her, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. As Elias was tying up the wagon in front of the general store, a familiar, cloying scent of roses filled the air. Ruby stepped out of the dressmaker's shop, a vision in emerald green. Her eyes narrowed when she saw Clara sitting on the wagon seat. Well, Ruby said, her voice dripping with venom. Look what the cat dragged in. Thorn, you sure you want to be seen with that? People might think you've gone soft in the head. Elias didn't rise to the bait. He finished tying the knot, and then turned to Clara, offering her his hand to help her down. It was a simple, gentlemanly gesture, but in the context of Ruby's taunt, it was a profound statement. Clara hesitated for a second, then placed her small, calloused hand in his large, warm one. His grip was firm and steady as he helped her to the ground. He kept his hand on the small of her back as he guided her toward the store, a silent, protective gesture that spoke louder than any words. He looked over Ruby as if she were nothing more than a fence post, his face an unreadable mask. The public defense, quiet and dignified, sent a shock of warmth through Clara's chest. Inside the store, he bought his salt and other supplies, treating her not as a servant but as a companion, even asking her opinion on a bolt of calico cloth. She was too shy to answer, but the fact that he asked was enough. He was deliberately, methodically, showing the town that she was not a thing to be bought and discarded, but a person to be respected. As they left, Clara dared to meet Ruby's hateful glare with a steady gaze of her own. For the first time, she didn't feel like a reject. She felt like she belonged somewhere. A new rhythm established itself on the ranch. It was a rhythm of shared work and shared silence. Elias was a patient teacher, showing her how to mend fences, feed the chickens, and tend the small vegetable garden Martha had planted. He never raised his voice, his instructions always calm and clear. In return, Clara brought a quiet order to the cabin. She cooked and cleaned with a silent efficiency that transformed the rustic space into a comfortable home. She discovered Martha's old sewing kit and began mending Elias's worn shirts, her stitches small and neat. One evening, she saw him struggling with his account ledger, his brow furrowed in frustration. He was a man of the land, not of numbers. Timidly, she approached. "I can read," she said softly, "and I'm good with figures. Mr. Croft used to have me do his books." Elias looked up, surprised. He pushed the ledger towards her. She sat down, and within an hour, she had organized the chaotic mess of numbers, her careful script filling the pages. He watched her, a sense of wonder dawning on him. The town saw a scarred, silent girl. He was beginning to see an intelligent, capable woman. The discovery pleased him more than he could say. The silence between them began to thaw. It was replaced by comfortable quiet, punctuated by necessary conversation that slowly bled into something more. He told her about the land, about the challenges of the seasons. She, in turn, began to speak of small things, a wildflower she'd found, a funny-looking cloud. They never spoke of their pasts, but they were building a present, one shared task, one shared meal at a time. One afternoon, while they were repairing a corral fence, a young calf bolted, kicking up its heels and running for the open prairie. Elias swore under his breath and took off after it. Buster, the old dog, joined the chase, barking excitedly. The calf was surprisingly fast, dodging and weaving. Clara, watching from the fence, couldn't help it. A laugh escaped her. It was a rusty sound, unfamiliar even to her own ears, but it was genuine. Elias, finally cornering the calf, looked over at her, a slow smile spreading across his face. It transformed his rugged features, making him look younger, almost handsome. In that shared moment of simple, unexpected joy, the wall between them crumbled a little more. But their fragile peace was not meant to last. A few days later, two riders appeared on the horizon, kicking up a plume of dust. As they got closer, Clara's blood ran cold. It was Silas Croft, and beside him, slouched in his saddle with his usual arrogant swagger, was Jed Stone. Elias saw them too. He straightened up from the trough he was cleaning, his body going still. "Clara," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Go inside. Lock the door." She didn't argue. She fled to the cabin, her heart pounding. She watched from the window, her hands twisting in her apron. Croft and Jed reined in their horses a few yards from Elias. "Thorn," Croft called out, his voice oily. "We've come to discuss a business matter." "There's nothing to discuss," Elias said, his voice flat. He didn't move, just stood his ground, a pitchfork held loosely in his hand. It wasn't a weapon, but it could be. "I think there is," Croft sneered. "I've been looking over my books. Turns out, you underpaid me for my property. She still owes me 2 years of service. I'm here to collect what's mine." Jed Stone just sat on his horse, a cruel smile playing on his lips, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. He was the muscle, the unspoken threat. "Her indenture was paid in full and signed over," Elias stated, his voice dangerously calm. "You have no claim on her. The paper you signed was for the purchase of her remaining contract at the time," Croft lied smoothly. "But it didn't clear the debts her father left behind, which she was working off. A legal oversight. I'm sure the circuit judge would see it my way. Or, you could pay me another $200, and we can forget this whole misunderstanding." It was extortion, plain and simple. Inside the cabin, Clara felt sick. He would send her back. $200 was a fortune. He couldn't afford it. He would have to give her up to save himself from the trouble Jed Stone was so clearly itching to start. Elias's jaw tightened. He looked from Croft's greedy face to Jed's menacing one. He thought of Clara's rusty laugh, of the way she'd meticulously organized his finances, of the quiet peace she had brought to his empty home. He thought of her terror during the storm. The idea of sending her back to this man, to that life, was unthinkable. It was a physical ache in his chest. He took a slow step forward. "She is not property, Croft, and she is not going anywhere. This is her home now." He looked directly at Jed. "You and your boss here need to get off my land." Jed's smile vanished. He straightened in his saddle. "That's big talk for a farmer with a pitchfork. Get off my land," Elias repeated, each word dropping like a stone. There was no fear in his voice, only a cold, hard resolve that promised violence if they pushed him further. For a long moment, nobody moved. The only sound was the wind whistling across the plains. Croft looked at Jed, then back at Elias. He saw the unbending will in the rancher's eyes and seemed to decide this wasn't a fight worth having today. "This isn't over, Thorn," Croft spat, pulling on his reins. "You'll regret this." They turned their horses and rode away. Elias stood watching until they were just specks in the distance. He finally let out a long breath and dropped the pitchfork. He felt a profound, bone-deep weariness, but also a strange sense of clarity. His impulsive act in the saloon had become something more. It was no longer about pity. It was about protection. It was about her. He turned and walked back to the cabin. The door was unlocked. Clara was standing just inside, her face pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. She had heard everything. She had expected him to barter, to argue, to give in. She had never, in her entire life, had someone stand for her like that. "He'll come back," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I know," Elias said. He walked past her to the water bucket and drank deeply. The silence in the cabin was thick with unspoken emotions. She was waiting for him to tell her to pack her things, to explain that the trouble wasn't worth it. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and turned to face her. The look in his eyes was steady and resolute. "This is your home now, Clara," he said, his voice quiet but firm, repeating the words he'd said to Croft. "No one is taking you from it." It was a vow, a promise that settled deep in her soul, pushing back years of fear and worthlessness. In that moment, watching this quiet, stubborn man who had declared his home her sanctuary, Clara knew she would rather die than be dragged away from him. The threat of Croft's return hung over the ranch like a gathering storm cloud. They worked with a new sense of urgency, their conversations now circling the unspoken problem. Croft's claim was based on lies, but in a town where his influence ran deep, a lie could easily become the truth, especially when backed by Jed Stone's gun. Elias knew that his word alone wouldn't be enough. He needed something more, something legally binding that would sever Croft's claim on Clara forever. One evening, after a long day of reinforcing the barn door and checking every lock on the property, they sat at the table, the ledger open between them. But they weren't looking at the numbers. Elias cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet cabin. "Clara," he began, his gaze fixed on the tabletop. "There's a way. To make sure he can't touch you. He finally looked up, his eyes meeting hers. The circuit judge is due in town next week. If we were married, Croft's claim would mean nothing. A wife can't be held to an old indenture. It would be a legal fact. Clara stared at him, her heart stopping in her chest. Marriage. The word was so foreign, so disconnected from her reality. It was something other women dreamed of. For her, it had only ever been a terrifying abstraction. It would be a partnership, Elias continued quickly, seeing the shock on her face. A business arrangement to protect you. To protect this ranch. Nothing would have to change between us. You'd be safe. That's all. He was offering her his name as a shield. A permanent, legal sanctuary. It was the most selfless, honorable thing anyone had ever done for her. And it was in that moment of profound gratitude that she knew she had to tell him the truth. She couldn't enter into such an arrangement, even one of convenience, with secrets between them. You should know, she began, her voice a near whisper, her hand instinctively going to the scar on her cheek. You should know why I'm like this. Why the gunslingers call me damaged. Elias just watched her, his expression patient, waiting. It was my father, she said, the words tasting like ash. He was a good man when he was sober. But when he drank, he changed. One night, he was in a rage about money. My mother tried to calm him. He threw a bottle. I stepped in front of her. She took a shaky breath. He died a year later. Drank himself into the grave. The debt he owed to Croft was for whiskey. That's how I ended up at the Crimson Garter. Working off the price of the bottle that marked me. She finally finished, her confession hanging in the air. She felt raw, exposed, expecting to see disgust or pity in his eyes. Instead, she saw a deep, aching sadness. He reached across the table, his movement slow, and gently covered her hand with his. His touch was warm and calloused, and for the first time, she didn't flinch. Your father's sins are not your own, Clara, he said, his voice thick with emotion. And that mark, he paused, his thumb gently brushing the back of her hand, is not a sign of damage. It's a sign you were brave. A tear she hadn't realized was forming slipped down her cheek. It was a tear of grief, but also of release. He saw her. He truly saw her, not as a reject or a servant, but as a person who had endured and survived. Yes, she whispered, her voice clear and steady. I will be your wife, Elias. The decision was made. A plan was formed. They would ride into town on the day the judge was scheduled to arrive and be the first in line at the makeshift courthouse. They spent the next few days in a state of nervous anticipation. A new intimacy grew between them, born of their shared secret and their common goal. They were no longer just a rancher and his ward. They were allies, partners preparing for a battle. The morning they were to leave, Elias came to the table with a small object wrapped in a piece of cloth. He pushed it towards her. It's not much, he said gruffly. She unwrapped it. Inside was a simple iron ring, hammered into a circle, filed smooth, but still bearing the marks of its making. He had fashioned it himself from a horseshoe nail. It was plain and unadorned, but it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. It was a symbol of his promise, of his steadfast, practical, and powerful protection. She slipped it onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. They rode into town not with the furtive fear of their last visit, but with a quiet, unified resolve. Clara sat tall on the wagon seat, the iron ring cold on her finger, a secret source of strength. Elias handled the reins with a steady hand, his jaw set. They knew Croft and Jed would be waiting. They were riding into the heart of the enemy's territory, but this time, they were riding together. As they predicted, Croft and Jed were loitering on the boardwalk in front of the general store, where a sign proclaimed it was serving as the temporary office of Circuit Judge Harlan Black. A crowd of curious townspeople had already gathered, drawn by the scent of a confrontation. Croft stepped forward as Elias helped Clara down from the wagon, blocking their path. Going somewhere, Thorne, he sneered. We have business with the judge, Elias said, positioning himself slightly in front of Clara. I have business with him, too, Croft said, his voice rising for the benefit of the crowd. Business about stolen property. This man, he pointed a dramatic finger at Elias, stole my indentured servant. And her, his gaze, full of contempt, landed on Clara. She's nothing but a runaway debtor, marked and worthless to any decent man. The insult struck Clara like a physical blow. She flinched, the old shame washing over her. But then she felt Elias's hand on her arm, a steadying pressure. She looked up at him, and his eyes, fixed on Croft, were as hard as flint. "You speak of her as property, Silas." Elias's voice was low, but it carried in the sudden hush. "But you're blind. You had a treasure in your house, and you treated it like dirt." He took a step forward, forcing Croft to take a step back. "Her worth isn't something you can buy or sell, and it sure as hell isn't something you can judge." Just then, the door to the general store opened. A tall, stern-looking man with a shock of white hair and piercing gray eyes stepped out onto the porch. Judge Harlan Black. He looked down at the scene, his expression displeased. "What is the meaning of this commotion?" he demanded, his voice carrying the weight of the law. Croft immediately turned to him, his demeanor shifting to one of a wronged victim. "Your Honor, this man, Elias Thorne, has stolen my legal property. This girl, Clara, is indentured to me. I have the papers to prove it." The judge's gaze moved from Croft to Elias, and then settled on Clara, who was half hidden behind Elias's frame. He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes taking in her frightened posture, her simple dress, and the pale scar on her cheek. "Is this true, girl? Do you belong to this man?" This was the moment. Her voice, her choice. All her life, men had spoken for her, decided for her, defined her. She took a deep breath, drawing strength from the feel of Elias's hand on her arm and the weight of the iron ring on her finger. She stepped out from behind Elias, meeting the judge's intense gaze directly. Her voice, when she spoke, was not a whisper. It was clear and steady, and it rang through the silent street. "My name is Clara," she said, "and I belong to no one." She then turned her head and looked at Elias, a world of trust and gratitude in her eyes. "I came to town today to ask the judge to marry me to Mr. Elias Thorne." A gasp went through the crowd. Croft's face turned purple with rage. Jedstone looked momentarily stunned. Ruby, watching from the edge of the crowd, had a complex expression on her face, part shock, part something that looked almost like grudging respect. The judge's stern expression softened almost imperceptibly. He looked at Croft's sputtering fury and then at the quiet dignity of the man and woman standing before him. He had seen 1,000 cases like this, of greed and cruelty hiding behind the thin veneer of the law. "Mr. Croft," the judge said, his voice cutting and final. "A proposal of marriage, freely given and accepted, supersedes any contract of indenture. Your claim is null and void. Now, I suggest you remove yourself before I find cause to look into your business practices more closely." Defeated and publicly humiliated, Croft glared at them one last time before turning and stalking away, Jedstone trailing uselessly behind him. The crowd began to disperse, murmuring amongst themselves. Judge Black looked at Elias and Clara. "Well," he said, a hint of a smile touching his lips, "it seems we have a wedding to conduct. Shall we?" He married them right there on the porch of the general store, with the town as their witness. When Elias slid the simple iron ring onto her finger, it was no longer just a symbol of protection. It was a promise. Their hands clasped, they looked at each other, and in that shared gaze, the last vestiges of the transaction, of the saloon, of the reject and the rancher, fell away. They were simply a man and a woman, choosing a life together against all odds. The ride home was cloaked in a new kind of silence. It was not the fearful quiet of their first journey, nor the cautious quiet of their second. It was a deep, resonant peace, the comfortable silence of two people who had faced down the world and won. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the prairie, and the air was cool and sweet. When they reached the ranch, Elias reined in the horses and, for the first time, turned to her before getting down. He simply looked at her, his eyes searching her face as if seeing it for the first time. He saw not the scar, not the fear, but the fierce strength that had spoken out in front of the whole town. He saw his wife. He dismounted and came around to her side of the wagon, holding up his hands to help her down. As her feet touched the ground, he didn't immediately let go. His hands rested on her waist, and he stood so close she could feel the warmth of his body. She looked up at him, her heart beating a steady, calm rhythm. He slowly raised a hand, and, with a gentleness that made her breath catch, he brushed a stray piece of hair from her cheek. His fingers grazed the edge of her scar. She didn't flinch. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into his touch, a silent acceptance, a quiet surrender not to his ownership, but to his care. He held her gaze for a long moment before letting his hand drop, a universe of unspoken emotion passing between them. In the months that followed, the ranch became a true home. The story of their stand against Silas Croft became something of a local legend, and when they went to town, the whispers were replaced by nods of respect. People saw Elias Thorne not as a fool, but as a man of quiet integrity. They saw Clara Thorne not as a reject, but as a woman of surprising steel. She found her voice, not just in town, but on the ranch. Her sharp mind for numbers and her quiet wisdom became as vital to the ranch's survival as Elias's strength. She was no longer just a resident of his home. She was his partner in building it. The shadows in her eyes receded, replaced by a calm light. The scar on her cheek was still there, a part of her history, but it no longer defined her present. It was simply a faint, silvery line on the face of a woman who was loved. One cool autumn evening, they sat on the porch, a comfortable quiet settling around them as the stars began to appear in the vast, dark sky. She was reading to him from a worn book of poems she had found on Martha's old shelf, her voice soft in the twilight. He wasn't listening to the words so much as the music of her voice. He watched the way the lamplight from the window softened her features, the way she smiled faintly at a particular line. He reached out, his hand covering hers where it rested on the open book. She stopped reading and looked at him. He said nothing, but his thumb gently stroked the back of her hand, over the simple iron ring that never left her finger. He then lifted his other hand and cupped her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her scar with an infinite tenderness. She closed her eyes, leaning into his palm, a soft sigh of contentment escaping her lips. There were no grand declarations, no flowery words. There didn't need to be. Their love story had not been written in poetry, but in shared labor, mutual respect, and quiet acts of courage. It was a love as rugged, as resilient, and as vast as the land itself. He looked at the woman beside him, his partner, his wife, his heart, and knew that in rejecting the saloon's glittering prize, he had found a treasure beyond measure. He hadn't just saved her. They had, in the quiet, steady way of things, saved each other. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. Her true worth was finally seen. What does true value in a person mean to you? Tell us below.